Hey guys, welcome back to another video. So today, if you're reading the title of the video, I am going to be showing you guys kind of like my planning process and just like general thumbnailing, rough drafts until we get to do our like final draft digitally. So we're going to go from my sketchbook to the iPad, but kind of to preface the video a little bit. So if you're a Quilldren like myself, you would probably know that I graduated recently. So I do want to do at least one more kind of like illustration on this channel, at least. I probably will still draw him from time to time, but I wanted to at least do one more kind of like last illustration because it was nice getting a lot of messages from you guys as well saying that you guys found out about either VTubers or Luxium or X specifically through my speed paints at the time a couple of years ago. But I won't dwell on it too much because I don't want this video to be super depressing. But I think the main focus for today will be just like showing you guys my process. But if you're a Quilldren, I hope me drawing Ike another time brings you a little bit of joy. But let's get started. So to kind of give you a little bit more context, oftentimes if I do not know what exactly I want for a composition, for an illustration, or like I don't really have any kind of planning done, I usually sketch in my sketchbook first and kind of let my brain vomit a little bit, like all the ideas to see whether or not things will work or if I want to include it or not. If I have like, let's say more than 50% of knowing what I want to do for the illustration, sometimes I jump in digitally right away. This is the one I did, I think, was it a week ago or 2 weeks? I did of Zeal. So this is the illustration that I ended up with. I'll put like a proper picture on the screen so we don't have this much glare. But this is kind of like my little sketch page of ideas and stuff, like either writing down notes, trying out different things to keep log of what I had for ideas. So for this drawing, just gonna be hard to see. Once again, I'll put it on the screen for you guys, but I do thumbnailing a little bit. Maybe we'll do this. So hopefully you guys can see better. I do like tiny thumbnails. Then I will flesh it out a little bit if I have like a good idea or like I want to see what it would look like if I needed to add more details. If I have extra poses or things that I think of last minute and the spread is kind of all finished, I'll just stick in sticky notes. I do sometimes keep notes of things. So I had like the flowers listed here. I tried doing like a mock-up of the bouquet. Sometimes my scribbles or like my planning is very much like more notes with like small thumbnails versus like more drawings. But yeah, so I'll take you guys through the process of me figuring out what I want to do for the illustration because I have ideas, but I haven't thought about how I want to have it all together. Does that make sense? So let's go ahead, put away my iPad and we'll start in my sketchbook. I don't think this is going to be like a super long session. So for sketching materials, I like to keep it usually in pen or pencil of some sort. Sometimes I add color. Ooh, okay, so right off the bat of my front page on Pinterest, I like this aesthetic. If I can show you. If not, I'll make sure to put this like properly on the screen somewhere. But I wanted to include flowers. I would like to include like letters or papers of writing of some sort, as well as him probably laying down or like resting. So I'm gonna jot down the ideas that I have from that little photo collage that I found on Pinterest. So let's go with a horizontal composition first. So I think the last time I drew, I think it was either Wonu or Ike sleeping with his glasses on, and people are like, make sure he has them off, otherwise it'd be very uncomfortable, and it's like not exactly realistic of keeping them on, I guess, if you're laying. I could keep it really simple like this and keep the the colors very light. I think I did something similar when Hugo graduated. Like this. I also wanted to do something with like letters and dry flowers. It's like a folded up letter or something like that with some sort of semblance of dry flowers like attached to them would be cute. And just remember, when you're doing like sketches and thumbnails, as long as they make sense to you, I think that's all what matters, to be honest. We'll see how I like this one. So sometimes I will just like freely sketch what the figure might look like regardless of like the composition. So I think we'll keep his eyes closed as if he's sleeping. Sometimes laying down poses, it's something a little bit funky if I don't draw the hair correctly. Maybe we'll go with something like this instead. This isn't always the case, but sometimes if I like a sketch enough or I want to make it stand out in my little spread, I will try to add a little bit more detailing or darken up the sketch a little bit so it kind of really pops from the rest of the other drawings on the page. Other times I don't really care what the entire page looks like, so I don't really darken up any of the sketches. Hopefully I'll be able to keep the color palette more on like the light color palette and make it a little bit more serene feeling and peaceful. We'll see. I think we're going to go with this actually. Okay, so we are going to be switching over to voiceover instead, due to the fact that I was not able to record the actual audio during this part of the session due to my neighbor having to do some like lawn care work, I guess, for the majority of the drawing session up until like actually the nighttime or like early evening. So I was not really able to record any sounds, so hopefully you guys don't mind the little switch over in audio. But let's go and talk a little bit about the process of when I'm working on the iPad. So I usually have my sketchbook kind of to the side, especially if I've done any thumbnailing work or any sketches like pertaining to the actual drawing that we're wanting to do on the iPad. So I will have that open so that I can always references and just like check it often just to make sure that I'm kind of like staying on the right track. In terms of the process, I started off with a larger kind of brown brush to quickly make our guidelines and figure out our composition and laying in the figure for the most part, and we're just keeping everything vague and kind of rough by doing like larger shapes for the most part. And then after that, I will lower the opacity, we'll switch brushes to something a little bit smaller, which happens to be the sketch round brush, and we'll work on our cleaner sketch. So this is basically the sketch that I'm going to be using in place of line art as well. So the cleaner the better, preferably. Otherwise we're going to have a lot of cleanup to do at the very end or even like before we merge all our layers together. So Ike kind of goes through a few changes here and there in terms of how I end up drawing him versus how he comes out in the end. So his face will change fairly a lot due to the fact that I ended up sketching his face a little bit more vague than I would have liked. I also end up changing the angle slightly, so his face won't be angled all the way like looking down as much as it will be later, because I wanted him to be a little bit more front facing just because the proportioning looked a little bit off. His face looked a little bit more squashed if anything, so to make it look a little bit more like him and just like less childish like, I wanted to elongate the face a little bit. We'll fix up the proportionings during the rendering phase, and I will end up changing his mouth as well, I believe. So any details that I want to add on top of our kind of like base, I will sketch in a different color and put them on a different layer so that I can freely move them without having to disrupt my already sketched out areas. So that's what I ended up doing for his hands. That way I don't really have to accidentally like crop or grab with the lasso tool like parts of his clothing, and we can kind of maneuver it a little bit easier without having to avoid lines either. So for this, I think for the most part, the sketching of Ike was on the easier-ish side. I definitely think there is a lot of details I ended up missing in terms of the sketching process, and I will have to kind of fill in a little bit later once we start doing the coloring and rendering. And I don't know if it was a good idea to do this right off the bat. Oftentimes, I don't fill in blacks with like the fill color bucket or whatever you want to call it. I don't like keeping them very flat. I usually color them in when I'm doing the painting phase of doing the rough colors. That way I can kind of like mess around with the lighting. I can throw in a bunch of different like hue shifts if I need to. But this time for some reason I thought it would be easier for me to speed up the process by filling in my flats first, because he does have a lot of black areas in his shirt. And then I don't know, I end up thinking I kind of work with a compromise between having it be a little bit more like bold and dark and kind of like more contrasty versus like usually a softer blend of colors if I were to color it in manually. But after I finished up the sketch, I set it to multiply. I also duplicated it at some point so that we have a spare just in case I want to restart. And then we can start off with the coloring of the background. I always try my best to color in the background as early as possible when it comes to just like coloring in general. That way I have a lot of the color or like the color palette kind of already established. We kind of have the lightings as well as some like of our tones just to help us know what colors we're going to be placing for the figure or objects in like the foreground or the background or whatever. It'll just help us give us more context, I guess, to all the colors. So initially for like the foliage, I ended up making everything a mixture of almost like cool and warm colors. So as we got lighter and brighter, I went a little bit more warmer. And then as we went a little darker, I kind of shifted more towards blue, making our shadows a bit more cool. So after that, I ended up blurring that section of the background. I was not really pleased with the shapes, but I already knew I was going to keep it very vague. And then I will switch on over to the lasso tool, and we can use it to kind of quickly throw in shapes of leaves and foliage so that I don't really have to paint them in. This is just much faster, as well as that I can kind of get sharper points and just the silhouette of leaves a little bit more recognizable than me just painting them in with a brush. So to kind of match the background and our lighting situation, I went ahead and alpha locked our silhouetted layer of leaves, and then we started to kind of like paint a general gradation of where our lights and our darks were. And then as I get a little bit closer to the actual leaves, I'll start to add a little bit more lighting, rendering, a bit more shape and form to each of them, so that they don't look like plain flat blobs, I guess, at this point. But I don't think I was too pleased with the color selection. So the colors that we have here are a little bit too vibrant and too bright for what exactly I wanted. Well, the brightness didn't really bother me. It was mostly like the color temperature and just like the overall vibe of it was not something that I was particularly looking for. So I ended up putting an overlay layer of a kind of mid-tone-ish blue and giving it almost like an overcast look. And it made everything significantly cooler, but I think that fits Ike's color palette quite well. He has a lot of like blue, whites, and black. So it was easier for me to imagine what I wanted for the colors after I had the background finished. So that's why I find it very important, if you can, establish your background colors or your background environment to some degree so that you can use that to your advantage when coloring your character. Obviously, if you do different steps, you can definitely kind of correct this along the way. You could also paint like the character as normal and then later on use some blend modes to help fix the character back into the background in a way. So we could use like overlay layers if we wanted to change the hue or like give it a little bit of a different color, as well as you can use multiply to give more shadows or depth, and then you can use like addition or screen to help with like highlights or anything like that, so you can kind of fit your character better into the background. So for coloring figures or objects that are in front of the background, I like to use the lasso tool alongside with the color fill option. And then we will basically use it to go all the way around our character, connect the two ends, and then fill it in with the base color, which for characters, I like to fill it in with their base skin tone. And then we'll start with the skin, we'll move on to eyes and hair, and then last but not least, we'll work on coloring in the clothing. So as I'm like coloring in sections and kind of like the order that I told you, let's say like skin, eyes, hair, clothing, I also try my best to do all the highlights and the shadows during that time per section. So I don't really do the thing where you fill in all your flats and then you do all the shadows for your flats and then all your highlights. I kind of do it section by section, and usually going from the most, I guess, how do you explain it? In terms of like layers, I find skin would be covered by most things. So I would do that one first so I can kind of be as messy I want. And then as we work up in terms of, let's say, eyes and hair, I need to be a little bit more clean and stay within the lines here and there so that we don't have too much to deal with a little bit later. So to make Ike even fit even more into the background, I added one more overlay layer. I ended up also adding a little bit of a highlight or like some kind of lighting to the upper left-hand corner. And then another overlay layer with the color kind of like a purple fuchsia-ish color. Oftentimes, like if I'm using any kind of blend modes that has like very intense color, I will typically kind of like knock it back quite a bit so that it's not super jarring. Because if I left the purple as it was, it would have been really weird looking, especially because I had it already clipped only to Ike's layer and not to the background. But I think after dimming it down a little bit and then merging my layers, I ended up liking the color palette for the most part. Now, I don't think it really helps for you guys because the lighting changes in my room currently because of like the sun, and I don't know, I was trying to color correct it. So apologies if it looked really blue initially and now it looks suddenly kind of more like a sunnier lighting, I guess, rather than like an overcast lighting. It's a little bit more warmer than what I was initially kind of working with at the very beginning. So I think for the most part, the color palette doesn't change too much from this state. There is something I'm going to add to the foreground that might just shift the color palette in general for the entire piece, but it won't really change too much in terms of like how I have kind of more of like a cooler, lighter green color palette going on for the background, and then the rest of him is kind of like rendered as normal typically. So as we are working on the rendering phase, I guess I didn't really explain how I got to this point technically. So after I ended up merging my sketch and my rough colors together, and kind of like before that step even, I will try my best to alpha lock our sketch and then change the sketch color to match closer to certain areas. So let's say for the face, I want it to typically be a little bit more warmer, so like doing softer browns or reds typically work a little bit better to kind of keep everything nice and soft, as well as some of like areas in his hair, something a little bit more cooler and darker would work best. And then that way I can kind of eliminate me having to open up the color wheel as much. It doesn't, I don't know, maybe it's just me. I always think that maybe I color pick a little bit more, but hopefully not opening up my color wheel as much if I have majority of the colors already established on my canvas. So hopefully that also helps with a little bit of like workflow and just keeping things a little bit more quick. But then after that, I will also end up adding any blend modes at that point. So multiply, overlay, or addition, or even screen to kind of fix the lighting. We can change the hue a bit. And then I will merge all those blend mode layers onto the same merged sketch and rough colors. Then after that, we can switch brushes to something like the sharp render brush and start to clean up, add some lines, darken things, cleaning up, sharpening, all that at this point. So now that we're kind of like caught up process wise, I might go a little bit off tangent at this point. I don't know if you can tell by my voice that I feel like I sound very tired, and the reason being is that it's almost 4 a.m. and I need to be up by 9 a.m. because I have to go to a bachelorette party, and me and my friend are part of the, I guess like the decorating side, because like me and her are the bridesmaids, so majority of the setup and planning was put on to us. So I might sound extremely tired, but hopefully I can get this video by out by Saturday since I have to leave on Friday. And yeah, there's too much going on this week, and I can definitely say that April really sucked, especially at the very end of April. So if you're kind of like in the VTuber space, I feel you, and I do apologize and just feel sorry or like feel bad, I guess, if you're also in the same boat as I am, where your Oshi has graduated, because at least I know at least 4 people have graduated within like the spheres that I'm in, because I'm a fan of Niji and Hololive. So yeah, like I said at the very beginning of the video, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I do appreciate that some people do in fact like some of my Ike Evelyn fan art, and I met quite a few Quilldren, so I am happy to hear that a lot of people in this community are very, very kind, and it's just hard to see him go, I get this, like at this point. But let's not dwell on like any sad things. So back to the drawing. I ended up pretty much doing all of the rendering for the most part, but I forgot like his earrings, his glasses even, and then I didn't do like small little like pendants or anything like that that's like on the lapels of his jacket shawl thing, so I'm throwing those in kind of last minute. I also added in the patterning to his scarf, so it was easier for me to just do one portion of the patterning and then copy and paste the elements into our little squares, so that we could pretend that the patterning is kind of like consistent. I also ended up doing those on separate layers, alpha locking them and shading them in so that they don't look too flat on the surface of the scarf. So moving on to our foreground. So I was not too sure how much I was actually going to blur these particular little tiny flowers. So on a separate layer in front of Ike, I ended up doing like white blobs, blue blobs, and trying my best to make some forms out of them. Added a little bit of green here and there to make sure that we have some stems to connect our little blobs. And I will end up changing the color palette to be a little bit more muted and fit the color scheme that is similar to the background. But to make sure that our flowers don't look too funky when I end up blurring them a heck of a lot, I want to make sure that I add a little bit of form and shadow prior to that. Otherwise, they really do just look like blurred blobs, and I do want them to have a little bit of a semblance of looking like a flower, if that makes sense, in the foreground. I think they actually turned out super pretty. I've done this a couple of times, but there's definitely kind of like a hit or miss depending on whether or not I added enough values to push certain elements to make sure that they don't look too flat prior to blurring. So one day when I have more energy, as well as just being a little bit less busy, I will definitely do more attempts at actually doing full backgrounds rather than these slightly cop-out-ish backgrounds where I just sandwich my character in between 2 blurred-ish areas, I guess. But other things I wanted to make sure that I didn't forget to do. So I wanted to embed Ike a little bit more into our foliage in the background. So I wanted to have a few of like leaves poking through and kind of interacting with his body so that it doesn't look like he's just like plainly in front of it and he's kind of like within our background. So I added a little bit to both shoulders, as well as I think there's like a set of leaves that are in front of his hair as well. So hopefully that kind of gives it a little bit more of a feel that he's within our little leaves, foliage, bush, or whatever you want to call it. Another thing that I'd like to do is making a duplicate of whatever drawing layers that I have visible right now, and then merging them, flattening them, and then we can Gaussian blur and erase where we want our focus to be. I ended up adding petals into the background as well, kind of like floating in front of him, and just like, you know, hopefully adding a little bit more oomph to everything, as well as adding a little border that kind of is sandwiched in between our foreground and our background. And then last but not least, I am going to add a little bit of text. I'm always wary about doing like hand lettering or any kind of text for something like this because I never really like how I ended up doing them, but I thought it would be nice to add something kind of to fill up the space on the left hand side. So I wrote thank you. I ended up doing the trick where you can duplicate your text, you can Gaussian blur it, use the automatic selection tool, invert your selection, fill it in, and then you kind of have an outline of your text. But I'm going to keep it like fairly light, so I ended up changing it to white and then making it more of like a muted faded color for our shadows. And then I think that's it for today's little session. I know it's a little bit more rambly than usual and maybe a little bit more incoherent at times due to the fact that I'm trying to keep my eyes open. But here's kind of our time lapse, and to be honest, when I started doing probably halfway through the coloring phase, I was actually debating whether or not I was gonna scrap the entire footage. I'm glad I ended up fixing his face and just fixing his demeanor a little bit and then adding the foliage into the foreground. Otherwise, it would have looked super incomplete. So there's just things I didn't really take into account when I did my planning phase. So, you know, just experiment, have fun, and I'll see you guys next time in the next video. Bye! Actually, I lied. I thought this was the end of the video. I forgot about this part. So here's kind of like the comparison of what I ended up sketching versus what my final of Ike actually looks like. And yeah, I thought it was kind of nice to kind of do another illustration like this. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoy it. And I'm super sleepy right now. So I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!